Hello friends, this is Christopher Davis-Shannon, and today we're going to talk about the blues. Not the genre of music, although this is linked to that in a way, but the musical form and the structure known as the 12-bar blues. What we play as a 12-bar blues now comes from usually a much simpler form than what we play today. So let's look at a few different versions of the 12-bar blues and see how we got to where we are now. One thing we want to note about the blues and the tonality of this song form is that it relies quite heavily on dominant seventh chords, or having a flat seventh. Even if this is the tonic chord, and this isn't something that we see a whole lot in previous Western music predating the blues, but something that we have grown very accustomed to. Although in European harmony we think of as dominant chord being unstable, in the blues it's not really. It actually just lends itself to a slightly different tonality. It's not quite major, it's not quite minor. It's blues. So you'll see that we're working almost entirely with dominant seventh chords here. We're going to work in the key of C, and our most basic blues form is what we call the 1-4-5, and this is one you've probably played before, and this is not just present in the genre of the blues, but we see this in bluegrass and old-time music, in rock and roll. It's all over the place. So we start out with 4 measures on the 1 chord, and we'll usually play this as a dominant seventh. So a C seventh. I'm going to use bar chord voicings. Feel free to use a regular C seventh. We're going to play that for 4 measures, or 16 total beats, and then we go to the 4 chord. Also as a dominant seventh. The 4 chord in C is an F seventh. So we go to an F seventh for 2 measures, or 8 strums. Then we go back to our 1 chord, 1 seventh, for 2 more measures, or 8 strums. So we have 4 measures of C seventh, 2 measures of F seventh, 2 measures of C seventh, and then we finally go to our 5 chord, a G seventh chord, just our typical dominant chord here. And we're going to play this for 2 full measures, and you might be wondering why, because a lot of times we walk down to a 4 here, but in the most simplistic version of the blues, this does usually stay on a 5 chord for 2 measures. It does not go down. We're going to add that in just a minute with some other things. So we got 2 measures of a G seventh, and then resolving to C seventh. We're going to just stay on the C seventh. This is our bare bones version of the blues. So let's play it together. I'll call out the changes as we go. Just nice down strums on it, starting on C seventh. 1, 2, 3, 4. F seventh. Back to C seventh. To G seventh. We stay here. Back to C seventh. Good. So now let's look at probably the blues form that most of us are more familiar with. Now next we have the next iteration of the blues, just building upon this 12-bar concept a little bit with a few chord substitutions in here. To start off, we're going to play C seventh just as before, but on the 2nd bar we're going to add a quick 4 chord. So we're going to go to our F seventh for 1 measure, right in the 2nd bar, instead of staying on C seventh. And then return right back to C seventh for those remaining 2 measures. We have C seventh, F seventh, C seventh, C seventh. Then we go to our 4 chord. As always, go back to the 1 chord just as we did in the previous blues. Now as we get to the 5 chord, to the G seventh, we're going to play the G seventh for 1 measure now, and now do what you're probably more accustomed to hearing, which started to crop up a lot more in 40s recordings and post that, and coming down to an F seventh to the 4 chords. We have G seventh, F seventh, to C seventh. And then we're just going to add a typical little blues turnaround on here. We're going to go 1, 4, 1, 5, or C seventh, F seventh, G seventh, C seventh. I will note here that that 4 chord, the F seventh, can very frequently be an F minor instead, a minor 4 chord. Either works just fine. So let's listen to just the last 4 measures of this new blues form, because that's really where the new stuff comes in. So we go G seventh, F seventh, and then our turnaround, C seventh, F seventh, C seventh, G seventh. All right, so let's try this next iteration of the blues form together, starting on a C seventh chord. 1, 2, 3, 4. And down to F seventh, back to C seventh, just hanging out there. To F7th. And this is the same. We're just hanging out on this. Up to C7th. Then G7th. Down to F7th. And now we're turning around. We have C7th, F7th, C7th to G7th. Now, let's jazz this up a little bit and start looking at a rudimentary jazz blues form. As early jazz players appropriated this form and started using it as a harmonic vehicle for soloing, we start to see some changes occurring here in the standard form and some additions that are really functioning, doing the same thing, but getting there in a different way. So the first line will start out the same. We're gonna have our C7th, and we're gonna have that quick forward to F7th, right back to C7th. We go to our fourth chord, the F7th. It's all the same so far. Back to C7th. But now we're going to walk that C7th down to an A7th. So from the 4 chord, we end up with a sound like this, starting on the 4th measure of our blues. We get that A7th, and that A7th acting as a dominant chord is really leading our ear somewhere. And where is that somewhere? Well, we're not going to the 5 chord. We're going to use our 2-5-1 progression here. So this A7th is leading us to our 2 chord, to a D. It is the dominant chord in relation to our D minor 7th or our 2 chord. I'm going to link to my video here on 2-5-1 progressions, why they're important and how to figure them out. So our turnaround, instead of now being 5 down to 4, we're just going to go 2 to 5, or D minor 7th to G7th. And just for fun, let's add a different turnaround on the end here. Instead of our 1-4-1-5, we're going to have a 1 chord, and then we're going to go to a sharp 1 diminished, or C sharp diminished 7th, and then D minor 7th to G7th. We're going to reiterate that 2-5-1 progression that we just played on the previous part. So now let's try this entire rudimentary jazz blues form together. Then we'll add some more. So starting out our C7th chord. 1, 2, 3, 4. Down to F7th, C7th, and stay here. Now we're going to our F7th, back to C7th, and down to A7th. And that gets us to our D minor 7th, G7th, and up to C7th, C sharp diminished 7th, D minor 7th, G7th. And that brings us right back to C. Now let's look at one more iteration of this, which really gives us all of the substitutions to get what we think of as the typical jazz blues form now. Now finally, we're really just going to add a bunch more 2-5-1s to this to give it more harmonic motion. But the underlying harmony is really the same, even with all these chords. And we're using a lot of chord substitutions here. I'm going to link to my video on common chord substitutions so that you can come up with your own. This blues form is very standard in the jazz world, but can also be played in a host of different ways. These are just some of the changes that work here. So we're going to start out on our 1-7 chord again, C7th, going to F7th, back to C7th. All is the same. But to get to our 4 chord, we're going to use the relative 2-5-1. So our 2-5-1 to get us to F is going to be a G minor 7th to a C7th. So we have G minor 7th, C7th, resolving. So let's listen to just these first 4 bars, how we get to that F7th now. So we get C7th, F7th, back to C7th, then G minor 7th, C7th. Just brings us to that F7th in a different way. Now we're going to have some fun on here. We're going to play this F7th for just 1 bar and then go to an F sharp diminished 7th. We're just walking ourselves back up to a C major chord. Really is what's happening. But we want to think about why this works. And that's because an F sharp diminished 7th, this chord right here, is just an F7th with an F sharp in there. All the other notes are the same. We still have that major 3rd and that dominant 7th leading our ear back to our C7th here. That gets us up to our C7th, and then we're going to use our 2-5-1 on the last line here again, but we're going to get there in a different way. We're going to borrow the relative minor 2, 5, 1. So to get to this D minor 7th, we're going to play an E minor 7 flat 5, just your E minor with a B flat on the first string, E minor 7th with a flat 5, and then A7 with a flat 9, which is A7th with an added. We're adding that B flat again. That's our important tone to get us to that D minor 7th, which resolves down to the A, creates tension, resolves down to the A. So we get a sound like this. Getting us to D minor 7th, and then G7th, we get our 5 chord again, and then we resolve to C7th, and then we're gonna go to A7, flat 9 again. This is the same chord as a C sharp diminished 7th, just depends what the bass player's playing. D minor 7th, and then we're gonna end this out on the turnaround with a C sharp 7th, which is a tritone substitution for our G7th chord, leading us back to the C7th. So this is really gonna just create a whole new feel to the blues and different motions going around, different tensions being created and released in different ways. So let's listen to this final iteration of the blues, starting on C7. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then down to F7, back to C7, G minor 7, C7, up to F7, F sharp diminished 7, to C7, E minor 7 flat 5, A7 flat 9, D minor 7, G7. Now our turnaround, C7, A7 flat 9, D minor 7, C sharp 7, resolve right back to our C7. So we see we're really getting to the same place with this harmony, but we're thinking about it in a different way. All of these are still the blues forms, just different iterations and building upon that initial 1, 4, 5 concept. And if you learn these iterations of the blues, how they work and why they work, you'll be able to incorporate a lot of this into your own writing and your own playing. You'll see these common substitutions that you can use and these common harmonic devices that get us where we need to go in different ways. I'll see y'all next week.